Allison, thank you so much joining us here, talking to Voice of America Persian Service. Let me start with this, since we are in election year, so almost, whatever the administration has done is open for review and criticism. How do you evaluate Biden administration foreign policy vis-a-vis Islamic Republic of Iran? If they had achievements, what are those achievements? If they had their failures, what were their failures?
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me, Kanbiz. It's great to be here and have this discussion with you. So I'd say first, there's some time left still in the Biden administration, and obviously we're in a really critical moment in the region. So it may still be a bit premature to do a full report card, but I would say that if we look at particularly the period before October 7th and the period after, I think it's important that we sort of consider these in two different ways. In the period before October 7th, I think what we saw was not quite an openness, of course, to go back to the days of the Obama administration JCPOA, and there was a number of reasons for that. In part, I think because of the way that Iran has been working with Russia, for instance, in the war in Ukraine, as well as because of some of the domestic constraints, say, on the administration, particularly from the right. We saw a lot of attacks on the JCPOA framework. So can't really say that we saw a return to that, but some quite tenuous, maybe progress, we could say, in terms of trying to revitalize, if not diplomatic relations, at least discussions. That was certainly borne out when we saw the release of American prisoners from Iran who were able to return home from their families. And again, that preceded October 7th. So certainly I would say we saw that would be, I would for sure call it a crowning achievement in the Biden administration's Iran policy. Since October 7th, even that sort of halting progress has been completely erased. And so unfortunately, what we've seen is not only the devastation in Gaza, but the way in which Iran has been able to use this instability in the region, particularly through its proxies, to continue to destabilize and add to this destabilizing situation. So right now, really a particularly difficult position for the Biden administration. Really, what we would need to see, and I think we've seen this with the efforts of CIA Director Bill Burns, Amos Hochstein, and others who have been doing a lot of diplomacy to try to reach a ceasefire. But again, still remains to be seen if and when that ceasefire will take hold.
You mentioned JCPOA. I think President Biden, even during the campaign, says he will bring U.S. back to JCPOA, and I think at the beginning there was some window that everyone thought that something might happen, but it didn't. But something else happened. Russia invaded Ukraine, and Islamic Republic decided to support Russia in a war which is in European territory, and also historically there is nothing between Iranian people and Ukrainian people. Still don't know why, but that might have made efforts from the administration harder for them to kind of come an agreement, right? Because the United States fully backed Ukraine from the beginning, and it still does.
It absolutely made things, I would say, infinitely more difficult. I mean, the progress that was made during the JCPOA was made during a time when we had Russia, we had China, and the United States all agreeing with Iran that continued uranium enrichment was globally destabilizing. We're in a very different moment now. Unfortunately, we've seen not only has Putin threatened the use of nuclear weapons, but also the alignment of Iran with Russia in this war, and the fact that Iran has continued to provide either weapons or supplies for weapons to Russia make it just impossible for the United States to make a warm diplomatic approach when Iran is actively working against U.S. interests. with the Russians. So again, not only do we see that the Russians themselves have less interest in actually addressing the threat of nuclear proliferation, but the United States administration is going to have a really difficult time working with Iran when it's supplying its enemy. And the other thing I'd mention there is again, that's not only when it comes to the sort of geopolitical context, but the domestic context is also much different than it was during the Obama years. Part of that is because of the, that we've seen this sort of increased alignment between Iran and Russia and to some extent China. But also I think we've just seen much more of an anti-Iran rhetoric that's taken hold, particularly in the far right. That's been made it quite difficult to make any progress, to really rethink what might come next after the JCPOA.
You mentioned October 7th. Do you believe October 7th is one of those events that changed the whole security policy of the region in the Middle East forever?
I don't believe that it's changed the security policy in the region forever. I think it was a catalytic moment that obviously completely changed the security dynamics in the region from what they were before October 7th until after. I think the question of how long those changes endure is still an open one. As long as the conflict continues in Gaza, as long as we continue to see Israel carry out indiscriminate attacks against Palestinians, Iran will be able to, and through Iranian proxies, will be able to continue to recruit to these proxies. And hold on, can I back up on that part?
Sure, of course.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you want to start from the beginning?
I'll just start from the part on October 7th.
Go ahead.
So I would say that as long as the war in Gaza continues, and as long as Israel continues to carry out indiscriminate attacks against Palestinian citizens, Iranian proxies like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like the Houthis will continue to gain in strength. They'll continue to recruit. The real irony is that these proxies say that they are carrying the banner of Palestinian liberation, but they're actually the ones who gain the most from Palestinian suffering. So that's a real problem immediately in this moment. And I also think, we need to be realistic about the fact that if we look at the peace agreement that was reached in Yemen, for instance, that was done at a time when the Houthis, they had gained in some strength, but certainly not to the extent that they feel empowered now after having been able to carry out these attacks in the Red Sea. Hezbollah similarly was unpopular actually in Lebanon prior to October 7th, and that's changed, and they're on a stronger footing. So we will have to deal with the emboldenment and the empowerment of some of these Iranian-backed militias, but I don't necessarily think that is such a fundamental shift that it would completely change a paradigm of what it might mean to actually counteract some of those nefarious entities.
Yeah, while we're at the proxies, I wanted to ask you this. After October 7th, President Biden says he will focus on to contain this war, so it won't spread to the other sides of the Middle East or region. But what happened in return is the proxies of Islamic Republic of Iran not only kept at it, but even raised the level of their attacks. Houthis, still today, as we speak, we are still doing it, and it seems the United States the only one who just trying to at least deflect whatever they are doing or so. Do you think that containment policy has been worked or not? If not, why it's not that much effective as it should be?
So I'd actually say the containment policy has been fairly effective. But again, this is simply containment. I mean, I think the proof positive of that, while it sounds ironic because, we did see Iran and Israel carry out strikes on one another's sovereign territory, which would have been, unthinkable a year ago. But that didn't actually escalate into all-out war. Similarly, I mean, I'm sure you as well as I on October 8th, on October 9th, were just sitting there, holding our breath, waiting to see whether Hezbollah would really enter into the fray with Hamas, as Sinwar was calling. And, we're waiting to see what Nasrallah would say. And actually, Hezbollah has not, up to this point, I think, brought the full force that they could into that conflict. Now, that doesn't mean that what we've seen is peace. I mean, let's be real. We've seen, Israeli citizens have had to move from their homes. Lebanese citizens have had to move from their homes. We've seen tragic loss of life, including civilian life, including journalists on the border of Israel and Lebanon. So I think to the fact that the Biden administration and others, because we saw, many others. Other Arab partners come together to expel the. We saw many other Arab partners also come together to repel the Iranian attack. So it's not the U.S. on its own. There's a coalition, the Brits and others as well. Semi-successful, I would say, at containment. Of course, the real question, today is going to be, well, two questions. One, will Israel proceed with an invasion in Lebanon? And two, I would say, what happens with the Houthis, even if there is a ceasefire? Do the Houthis say, okay, that's it, there's a ceasefire, we're going to stop attacking ships? Or do they say, hey, this actually allowed us to achieve some of our aims, and maybe we'll find another excuse? So in the Red Sea, on the border of Lebanon, still very tenuous situations, but I would say up until this point, the administration has done fairly well at containment.
Thank you for that. The other one of the criticism that comes to the administration based on the situation of the Russian war, or what's happening in the Middle East, or Houthis, is that the administration is not taking care of peace through strengths, or maybe a better deterrence. What's the best response that you could give to the critics who somehow say not a good deterrence has been implemented by the Biden administration?
Strength looks many different ways. And I don't think that strength should be only military strength. I think it's important to think about what's required in the immediate, and that's certainly, as we've seen with some of the targeted strikes around the Red Sea and in Yemen, that may be actually striking at particular capabilities, and so there are instances in which military strikes are necessary and critical as deterrents. But let's take a step back and think, why is it important actually to the United States to counter Iranian influence in the region? And that's because, as we've seen through many of these proxies, they're not good governors. The people who live under Iranian proxy leadership, if you can even call it that, suffer greatly. So, whether it's thinking about how to build more resilient, democratic, prosperous societies, I think that there are other ways to do that other than through military deterrence. And so a long-term strategy also has to look like investment in good governance, investment in, in the case of Lebanon, an effective, security alternative. So Lebanese armed forces, for instance, who right now can't even pay the salaries of their soldiers. That could also be what strength looks like, not just showing up with fighter planes and tanks and guns, but actually working to build the kind of democratic, prosperous, free societies that the people in the Middle East really deserve, and why they would prefer what they would prefer to live under, other than the governance of the Houthis or Hamas or Hezbollah.
Well, you mentioned militaries, paramilitary groups, proxies with Islamic Republic, but even if you put them aside, there are three things that it looks very worrisome when you look at it. You mentioned Lebanon. They have a very, very dysfunctional governance for the last couple of years. It's not now. Syria hasn't still been settled with whatever is happening inside. And Afghanistan is almost left alone, so not much of even knowing a policy. How do you address these three? Because these are just left alone areas, and we don't see much of a movement, we don't see much of a policy. Isn't it that worrisome, the same to you, the way you look at it?
It's very worrisome. I mean, particularly looking at the situation in Syria, where sadly We've seen now efforts to normalize Assad. The UAE even invited him to the climate conference that they held. I think this is tragic. I mean, not just because of the absolute horrors that Assad has wrought on the Syrian people, but also because of, again, the way that he represents interests that are completely antithetical to the United States and the free world. I do think that if we're looking at these different situations, right, the way that we consider what's happening in Syria vis-a-vis what's happening in Lebanon will be a bit different. But I do think there's the landscape that you've laid out drives home the point that this is not something that the United States can do alone in thinking about how to deal with whether it's nearly failed states or completely tyrannical actors or the likes of the Taliban. This is something the United States is going to have very different relationships or lack thereof with these. So that's where I do think it's important for the United States to work with other partners in the region to think through what sort of strategic plan should be. Because the United States, again, I think won't have relationship with Syria, won't have relationship with the Taliban anytime soon. And so the sticks and carrots that are available, whether that's sanctions or trying to provide pathways, in the case of Lebanon to rebuild, will be more effective if they can be done in concert with partners.
At the moment when there is conversation about next administration in the White House, the one that starts January 2025, the idea is that if it's Republican getting back to the White House, there would be more like a maximum pressure campaign on Iran, much more hardline policies. But we don't know if Joe Biden wins his second term, what happens with this foreign policy? Would it stay more the same, or do we see recalibration, revisions, or some new initiative? How do you think the possible second term of Joe Biden foreign policy will be?
I think that a second term always provides a president with the opportunity to reflect on a first term. And decide what to continue, what to leave behind, and maybe what to take up more boldly. I think, again, after, we desperately need to see a ceasefire in Gaza. Once that happens, I think there'll be a lot of thinking through about what the next phase of reconstruction looks like. And we know that the administration has expressed, like many administrations before, its emphasis on creating a Palestinian state. I think this is, more so than October 7th. I think the genuine establishment and investment in a Palestinian state, that has the potential to reshape the region and to force a rethinking around security alignments and political alignments that may create a bulwark against Iran. So I would hope that this is the pathway that a second Biden administration would invest in. Again, really using all diplomatic tools to muster financial and political support for the establishment of a Palestinian state, which won't be easy. I mean, the Israeli government has not minced words in saying that they're not ready for that right now. And many of them have said they will never be ready for that. But I really think that this is the key to being able to cut down on the ability of Iranian proxies to recruit, to be able to develop the kind of sort of diplomatic momentum that might be needed, and to think about ways to deal with Iran that are not just military forward. That's another part that it's baffling a little bit. Hamas is a terrorist group. One of their major backers is Islamic Republic of Iran, but they have other backers too, like Turkey and Qatar. And Turkey is a NATO ally. Qatar is a non-NATO ally of United States. US has lots of bases over there or so.
how is that these three have something in common in supporting Hamas?
Well, I think it's important also to consider the different types of support. While Qatar may be providing political support to some factions of Hamas, particularly by providing them safe haven to live in Qatar, I think that's quite different from the material support that we've continued to see from Iran even after the October 7th attacks. With Turkey, it's also been a problem that Erdogan has continued to voice, voice support for Hamas in ways that have been, I think, less constructive perhaps than the role that Qatar has played in mediating. So I do think it's important to consider these three and the different, let's say, flavors of support that we've seen, particularly because I think that the role that Qatar has played as a mediator, and one that I think many hoped Turkey may have been able to play, but that Erdogan, because of his anti-Israel statements, has made clear that he's not interested in. Qatar has gotten a lot of heat in ways that I think are not quite fair to its role. So I think I think there's a big question then of, again, moving forward, what will it mean to actually break some of these support? It's a big question, and I know one that folks in the White House and elsewhere have been concerned about. Would Hamas be able to use a ceasefire to recuperate and rebuild? President Biden said it himself. I mean, they've been so weakened militarily that they would not be able to carry out another October 7th attack right now. And so then I think it will be, again, if there's a viable alternative to the type of vision that Hamas has of liberation through violence, I think that cuts down on its recruitment. And then I think it's a matter of targeting the financial networks that have been able to provide its support through continued sanctions, as well as to geographically isolate, cut down the tunnels, et cetera.
Well, usually when we talk about the things in the region, I mean, it's impossible to escape Islamic Republic of Iran, and one way or another, they're connected to some part of it. One thing I wanted to ask you: the critics of the Biden administration would say that he was soft on Iran, or didn't put the pressure as it should be. But at the same time, United States government of United States, Joe Biden administration, have not removed any kind of sanctions. I think the last number they announced was 571 new sanctions they put as Islamic Republic of Iran. I inquire with OFAC all the time. They say we haven't moved any kind of sanctions. Where this perception is coming from, that they say it's not tough, but at the same time I cannot find anything to back up that kind of being easy on Iran.
It's a good question, and I think maybe the better question would be, what does it mean to be hard on Iran? Because I think that there are some particularly in the U.S. Congress, and we've seen this over the past few months, that have really called for direct strikes on Iranian soil. And so I think if that's your marker of what an appropriate way to deal with Iran is that you want to actually see an explicit military confrontation on Iranian soil, then of course anything that doesn't meet that threshold is going to feel soft. But you're completely right. I mean, there's been continued sanctions. I think that to say the Biden administration has been soft on Iran is completely false. I mean, continued sanctions. There's been strikes on again Iranian proxy stockpiles in Yemen, where the Houthis have been storing weapons. I mean, I think the administration is not being soft, but is avoiding all-out war. And the other thing that I would mention is, again, if we're thinking about what the what the long-term goals are of why it's important to counter Iranian influence. I mean, it's, you know, we talked about why the influence through proxies is so damaging for people in the region, but so much also comes to the nuclear ambitions, which is destabilizing for the whole world. And of course, you know, the JCPOA actually set limits, and, you know, for its flaws, was you know, effective at seeing Iran you know, agree to those. And it wasn't until that was rolled back that we immediately saw, you know, stockpiling far beyond those limits, and actually up to the point where today, you know, I think by some estimates, Iran could have a nuclear weapon within days. So despite the maybe, you know, rhetoric of what constitutes being hard or soft, I think the question is what's most effective.
Last question, if I may. Civil society in the region, in Middle East. I think they are the real change, the engine of change, or the shaping of the change in any kind of region. We see two different stark views at the moment. Afghanistan, we almost don't hear anything about the women or girls who they have access, they face lots of limitation in their own life. In Iran, 2 years ago, Women Life Freedom started, you know, in some ways it still goes on. How do we put that US foreign policy in some kind of a perspective that really helps the people who genuinely want a good change? I mean, like effective change, not exactly in forms of regime change, but at the same time they want to achieve something, some progress, some kind of a better life.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought this up, because I think it's so important to always bring things back to, you know, what do the people who are living in the region actually want and desire. You know, you raised two great examples. I would also mention the change movement in Lebanon after 2019 that came out in opposition to widespread corruption. You know, we've seen, obviously, since the Arab Spring movements in 2011, very beleaguered civil society that's faced counter-revolution. I think it's so important for U.S. policymakers to continue to orient themselves and to constantly orient themselves to those who are risking often their own lives, if not their livelihoods, to create some kind of a better future for next generations. And as you said, that doesn't always look like regime change. Sometimes that looks like reform. Sometimes that looks like finding any area where there may be some opportunity to expand rights and dig into that. I think where the U.S. can play a role is in continuing to support those indigenous movements. So it's not only about sanctioning leaders where they're acting in ways that are violative of rights, but it's also looking for those who can be supported, you know, whether it's through, you know, democracy and development programs, you know, to make sure that they are also empowered. I mean, sometimes it's even as simple as just meeting with some of these folks and providing a measure of protection so that they can continue really to do the work that's going to make the change. That's not something that's going to come from the United States. That's not something that's going to come from the White House. But it's critical that those who are here in D.C. Are constantly oriented to, you know, drumming up as much support for those folks as possible.
Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciated you coming here and talking to us.
Thanks, Kanbiz.